Okay, so before we get started, does anybody have any questions about the paper? Okay, so yep, it's due Wednesday. If you want me to look at something before you turn it in, today would be the day to do that, right? If you have something you want me to see it, I promise that if you give it to me today, I will look at it. If you get me something tomorrow, I will look at it if I have time. All right, so I got two handouts for you today. The first is just the usual bibliography, so you can just pass that way. And the second is a little exercise to help you better understand what Eliot is doing in the wasteland. So you can just pass those that way. So what I'd like you to do with the sheet I gave you that is not the bibliography is take, let's say 15 minutes. What I want you to do is sort of go through these, and I want you to construct a poem out of whichever ones of these you select, right? So you'll go through and you'll choose something you think you can make into a poem yourself, right? If you need to write like connecting lines between different things, that's fine, right? You can use some of your own stuff too. But the thing I want you to do is get to make a poem using this material, right? And of course, some of these quotes are long, right? So you can excerpt bits of it.
So we take 1 or 2 lines out of each and create a poem?
You don't have to use them all. So yeah, just go ahead, look through them first, read through them, and see where you can maybe find a common thread with some of them you can kind of make a little poem around.
Do we need to have like a specific amount of structure happening? Right.
There doesn't need to be any specific structure. What were you going to say?
Like mine, a poem for happening.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, just make it.
Yep. Yep, y'all are going to write a poem. Take 2 more minutes. Okay, so before I ask you to read what you wrote, I want you to reflect a little bit on the quotes you were given here. What did you notice about them? Where are they taken from? Some of them are taken from songs, yeah. Some of them are, yeah, are taken from pop songs, right?
It's taken from the Exorcist, so that just, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, there's stuff that's taken from films, right? What else?
It all has the same theme of tragedy.
Okay, a lot of it seems vaguely tragic, okay. What else in terms of the sources, though? So we got pop songs, we got films, what else have we got?
Horror movies.
Pardon?
Horror.
I can't hear you.
Horror.
Oh yeah, we've already got films. Yep.
Tragedy.
Okay, yeah, tragic plays, right? In fact, we have like some general quotes from literary classics, right? And some stuff from TV shows as well. So, what we have here is kind of like a mix of what a lot of critics refer to as high culture and low culture, right? So while a lot of these things may be thematically similar, thematically connected, some of these things would not typically be regarded as serious literature, right? And apart from kind of like a general idea of tragedy or sadness, did you see any other kind of like connecting points between some of these things? I mean, you would have had to build a poem out of it, right?
There's a common theme of heaven and hell.
Okay, yeah, a lot of these things reference heaven and hell, sure. Okay. Anything else that y'all pulled out of this?
Sadness, depression, feeling like life is going nowhere.
Okay. Powerlessness, maybe, yeah. Anything else? Well, let's hear what y'all did with this. Let's start over here with you, Jessica. So you definitely picked a particular theme to go with, all right? Bethany.
Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my game. It's our come round at last, the illusion of being controlled. Heavy tears run down my cheeks. I've taken more falls, scared. Living my life like there's no tomorrow, I always pretend. I think the point is to make us despair.
Okay, so yeah, you certainly picked up on she was picking up more on kind of the heaven and hell, God and the devil thing, right? And you were picking up more on the powerlessness thing. All right, interesting. Caroline, what did you come up with?
I don't think I did it right. But anyways,
There's no right or wrong way to do it.
okay. I live my life like there's no tomorrow. I will never choose to be changed. No need for second guessing or remaining in one place. We only get one life, you see. I intend to live mine well. Life is not here to give you happiness. You have to make it where you can. So get out because your tomorrow's real. Yeah,
Okay.
I thought that you meant just pull one. I didn't know.
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
yeah, no, it's okay. So you pulled one thing and you extrapolated from it.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, that isn't wrong, but that is something that Eliot's doing here too, right? He's doing the things that that all of you have done, right? The basic point I'm trying to make is that one way to understand this poem, to have it make a little bit more sense, because I know it's difficult and confusing, is to think of it as a collage. Right? And I think we talked about collage in a previous class session. But just as a reminder here, right, what is a collage in art?
Just different pictures. Like what? You mean art?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's depends on what you're doing, but there can be a specific thing, but there cannot be a specific thing. You just pull from all different kinds of sources and relevance.
Yeah.
Like one theme, though, right? Sort of.
But yeah,
It depends on the artist.
pardon?
It depends on the art that
Yeah. But the basic idea is that you're taking existing materials, right? You're cutting them up, and you're making something new out of them that may or may not reference the materials they were originally made out of. And that is what Eliot is doing here in poetry, right? And the reason I had a mix of high culture and low culture stuff is because that is a big part of what he's doing, right? A lot of the poem is made up of quotations, either from popular songs of the post-World War I era, or from Renaissance plays, medieval poems, Greek and Latin literature, right? So Eliot is a very learned poet, and he likes to wear a lot of that on his sleeve. But he is also a poet who is interested in jazz and in music hall and in various forms of popular entertainment. So this quote from the poem I've written up on the board here, these fragments I have shored against my ruins. I write here because I think it's key to understanding, like that this particular line is the key to understanding the whole poem. So let's think about what might be meant here by ruins and why the poem is called The Wasteland. So the poem is written and first published in 1921. Now what is in the very recent past that we may have just talked about in a recent class session in 1921? World War I, exactly. So what Eliot is looking at here is a world that has been torn apart by war, right? Nearly a generation of young men killed off. Right? Fields that could have been used for farming, torn apart by trenches. Innovations in killing large numbers of people at one time, right? And so, like a lot of other artists at the time, he's looking at what seems to him like the death of Europe, right? So when he talks about the fragments he's shoring against his ruin, right, against his ruins, I think what he means by this is taking these various fragments of European culture and building a kind of defensive wall out of them, right? I am going to take these things, I'm going to take these bits of poetry, these bits of plays, and these bits of songs, and I am going to wall myself in and protect myself using these familiar things from the decay that I see setting in all around me. And much of the poem is concerned with natural processes, natural cycles, decay, and fertility, right? So Eliot is what we often refer to as a high modernist. So modernism refers sort of mostly to the period in which he's writing. So it's a period kind of roughly from 1885 to about 1939. We refer to him as a high modernist because he is also modernist in technique, right? Not just the era that he's writing in. He's a genuine experimentalist. So other writers we tend to put into this category include W.B. Yeats, at least his later poetry, Virginia Woolf, Ezra Pound, and Wyndham Lewis. And what distinguishes the high modernists, as I said, is a kind of experimentalism. Particularly in terms of form. So, like the realistic novel that follows a protagonist, sort of day to day through, the streets of London, living an ordinary life, is not the sort of thing that the high modernists are interested in. They feel like what was typically called realism, with its, prosaic descriptions of bourgeois protagonists doing ordinary bourgeois things, was not actually all that realistic. So what they're aiming for is actually kind of higher realism that illustrates inner states of being. So, for example, have any of you ever heard the term stream of consciousness before? Okay, what's stream of consciousness?
It's a thing in psychology where it's like the amount of consciousness you have, but compared to the rest of your brain, like you don't know how much the rest of your brain have, like under 90%
Sort of. So yeah, it is a concept that originates in psychology. Specifically with the guy by the name of William James, who was the brother of the novelist Henry James, who was also a high modernist. Stream of consciousness specifically is a technique of narration in which the narrator simply reports thoughts as they occur, right? So instead of following the narrator's day-to-day activities with a third-person narrator hanging around over their shoulder, a stream of consciousness tends to be first-person and simply kind of like records the protagonist's or the prospective character's thoughts as they proceed through whatever it is they're doing. So the idea is to represent the way our consciousness actually interacts with the world around us. So it is, as I said, aiming at a kind of higher form of realism, right? Like an actual representation of human mental experience. In that sense, it's actually kind of similar to what a lot of the Romantics were doing with the greater Romantic lyric, right? They were primarily concerned with representing mental activity. And the high modernists are doing something quite similar, but often in ways that are a little bit more difficult to comprehend, right? And that's another facet of high modernism, is that it tends to be self-conscious, in part because it's experimental, it's also self-consciously difficult. Most of the writers working in this particular idiom are highly educated, multilingual, and they like for you to know it. Yeah, there is a kind of arrogance about high modernism, like the poet in his tower looking down on you and kind of daring you to understand what he wrote, right? So if you didn't understand The Wasteland, Eliot would probably say, good, you weren't supposed to. In fact, you may have noticed that the footnotes that are Eliot's own footnotes, right? Yeah, they're basically a middle finger to his editor. His editor loved the poem, but thought it was too confusing for the general reader, so asked that Eliot include explanatory footnotes. So Eliot, fuck you, I'll put footnotes in this one. The footnotes that he gives us are more confusing sometimes than the poem itself. Although really what's going on in the poem, right, we can draw out thematically certain things that are important here, right? And if we look at kind of the framework of quotation as well, then it gives us a good sense of what's going on. Now, as I said, one thing that he is primarily concerned with here is fertility and infertility. Right, hence the wasteland. What is a wasteland, essentially? Yeah, it's a desolation, right? It's like desolate wilderness. And so, he's tying the idea in fact, he's getting the idea of the wasteland from medieval literature. Specifically, from the myth of the Holy Grail.
Yeah.
So what do y'all know about the Grail myth? Okay, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Okay, I was reading somebody criticizing Monty Python for not understanding the source material well enough when they made the Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But I think actually, the fact that the movie is so fragmentary and ends basically without, basically ends in the middle of action, is actually shows a really good understanding of what medieval manuscripts really looked like. But yeah, so apart from Monty Python,
Sorry,
it's okay. No, I love that movie. I love the hell out of it. What else do we know about the Grail myth, if anything?
Complicated family tree and personal was a questionable character.
Okay, yeah, that a lot of it is concerned with this family that rules the wasteland, right? But yeah, you remember this specifically from fantasy class, right? We talked about the first mention of the Grail in any source, right? The 13th century romance Perceval by the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. And Chrétien doesn't directly connect the Grail to any kind of specific Christian mythology, right? When he writes his Grail story, it's not the cup of Christ. It's a serving dish that is carried through a room to Percival never asks who, right? Like, his mistake is that he never asks who the Grail serves, and thus the wasteland remains a wasteland. But the central character in the wasteland portion of the romance is a guy referred to as the Fisherman, because he sits in a little boat most of the day and fishes. Now, the reason he sits in that little boat is because he has been wounded through the thighs Now this is a medieval euphemism for castration. So he is the king of the wasteland as a result, right? Because the king's body is infertile, so is the kingdom he rules. So part of the, it seems that like what Percival was supposed to do was ask who does the Grail serve, and had he done so, it would have restored the Fisher King and the kingdom. But because he doesn't do that, the Fisher King's wound doesn't heal, and neither does the land around it, right? Now, a lot of this is spelled out and connected to pagan fertility rituals by two writers shortly before Eliot, right? The first is a guy by the name of J.G. Fraser, who wrote a book called The Golden Bough. And what Fraser did was try to connect religions which feature a dying God who is reborn, which is a surprisingly common motif across different religious traditions. What's that? It's not reincarnation. He's talking about kind of like the literal resurrection of a god. So, for example, the obvious example that Fraser points to is the Christ story, right? But he compares it also to the Egyptian story of Osiris, to the story of Dionysus in Greek mythology, to the Babylonian god Tammuz, and even to the Norse myth of Odin hanging himself from the magic tree in order to learn the runes, and then coming back to life at the end of that, right? And so he connects these life, death, rebirth myths to fertility ritual, right? That kind of celebrate the land coming back in the spring and then going fallow in the winter. Now, Jesse L. Weston uses Fraser's basic framework in a book called From Ritual to Romance. Which is kind of the specific reference that Eliot uses in constructing this particular poem. So he's using Fraser's basic framework, but he's using it kind of filtered through Jesse L. Weston, who's specifically applying this to the Grail myth and to the idea of the wasteland as presented in the Grail myth, right? Everybody with me? Everybody following? More or less? Okay. So, what I want us to try to track then is how this works out in the in Eliot's poem, right? So if we turn to the beginning of the poem to page 660, what is the first section of the poem called? What's the title he gives it?
Burial of the Dead.
The Burial of the Dead, yes. Now, it refers specifically to the burial service of the Anglican Church. But if we look at the actual content of this section of the poem, it's talking essentially about kind of like two things to do with the dead body, right? One, to bury it. Pardon? Actually, dunk it in water. So let's look at how these different things play out here. Can I get somebody to start reading for us on page 660, starting with April is the cruelest month.
April is the cruelest month of breeding. Violets out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull fruits in spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers.
Okay, so let's pause here for a second, right? And what we start with here is a fertility image, right? The lilacs growing out of the dead land. It's a spring comes, winter is over. Right? April is the cruelest month because this is the month when the earth breaks up to let new life out, right? Now, if you could continue, please, starting with Summer Surprised Us.
Summer surprises coming over the
Starnberger's Day. Yep.
With a shower of rain, we stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bengard kein Brusen Stem aus.
Litau and Ekdoi. So this is Eliot showing off that he speaks several languages, right? This is in German.
I am not Russian at all. I come from Lithuania, a true German.
Yep.
And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. He said, "Marie, Marie, hold on tight," and down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter.
Okay, so this is one of many different voices in the poem, right? The second half of this verse paragraph is entirely in the voice of a woman named Marie Lariche. Or Lariche, I think is how it's pronounced. And Marie Lariche was the cousin of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. Oops. So, we're good. Everything's good. So, have any of you ever heard of Mad Ludwig? Does this sound familiar to everybody? Anybody?
What?
Mad Ludwig?
Sounds familiar.
Okay, so Ludwig was a 19th century Bavarian king, right? There was no unified Germany at the time. And he was called Mad Ludwig because he spent a fortune building these elaborate fairy tale castles. Have any of you ever been to Disney World? Okay, but you're familiar with like the Cinderella's castle that's in the center of the Magic Kingdom, right? That's actually based on Ludwig's castle at Neuschwanstein in Bavaria. So that's the kind of thing he was doing with his time and money, right? So two things are important here about Ludwig. Actually, really three things, right? One, he was bankrupting the country. Two, he was homosexual and thus unlikely to produce an heir, more or less openly so. And three, he drowned under mysterious circumstances. It is believed that for reasons 1 and 2, some of his courtiers may have had him drowned, right? And the place where he was drowned was the Starnberger See. Hence the reference to that, right? So drowning actually becomes a kind of important pattern in the poem, which is related to both homosexuality and infertility. So if we go from this passage, for example, to later on Madame Sosostris, the famous clairvoyant who's reading the tarot cards, right? One of the cards that she draws is the drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look at the bottom of page 661. And the Phoenician sailor is connected on page 666 to Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant, unshaven with a pocket full of currants, CIF London, documents at sight. Ask me in demotic French, not demonic French. To luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. So the Cannon Street Hotel and the Metropole were well-known gay hangouts in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So the final connection here to drowning is in Death by Water, the next to last section of the poem, on page 669. Right? We have Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls and the deep sea swell, and profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. Now, the reason I point this particular strand out, right, all these references to drowning and the kind of connection that Eliot is making between death by water and homosexual activity, right? Compare what happens to a corpse in water compared to one that is buried in the ground. What happens when you bury someone in the ground eventually?
They rot.
Yeah, they rot, they decay, right? And then what does that decay? What does that decay do? Yeah, exactly. So new life is bred out of the dead body when it's buried in the ground, right? Now, what happens when the corpse is left in the water? It bloats.
It eventually decomposes, but then it'll sink to the bottom of the
Yeah.
river, ocean, or river itself.
Yeah, and it'll just kind of dissipate, right? It won't feed the land in the same way that a corpse that rots in the ground will, right? And this all sounds very, very morbid, right? But this is the basic distinction here that Eliot is making, right? So the drowning, or the drowned body, is connected to infertility. And infertility is the thing that I think the poem is most afraid of. So if we continue on page 660 with the burial of the dead here, can I get somebody to read, starting from what are the roots that clutch?
Whatever roots that clutch, what branches grow, out of the stony rubbish, Son of Man. You cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either. Your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising towards you. I will show you fear when it is cold.
And I think that this is another one of those key lines in understanding what's going on in the poem, right? Like these fragments I have short against my ruins. So these fragments I have short against my ruins, I think it kind of helps us understand the technique. I think that this particular line, I will show you fear in a handful of dust, is the key to the theme. When I first read this poem when I was in high school, I read this line and I wrote it all over all my notebooks because it just sounded metal. It's like, I will show you fear in a handful of dust. That's badass, right? I had no idea what the hell it meant. But now, with age and experience, I will show you fear in a handful of dust, right? What's dust?
Dead particles.
Dead particles, yes. talking about dusty soil. Is this soil you can grow anything? Yeah, it's dead in every sense here, yeah. So, I will show you fear in a handful of useless, infertile dirt, right? So this is, again, a reference to infertility, generally speaking, right? You pick up the earth of the wasteland, and it just runs through your fingers. It's nothing, right? It's just dust. So, I would like to turn from here to the fire sermon, pages 666 and 667. So each of the headings is a reference to some other text, right? So the burial of the dead, we already said, okay, so that's the Anglican burial rite. The fire sermon is a reference to an early Buddhist text in which the Buddha warns his followers to achieve, he instructs his followers to achieve spiritual purity by avoiding worldly physical temptation, right? Specifically kind of carnal temptations. So, not allowing the fires of lust to burn you. So this is where we have the Mr. Eugenides section, where Mr. Eugenides is kind of making the homosexual proposition to someone, right? But then right after that, we have this bit that is narrated by a character from Greek mythology called, damn it, I'm okay, everything's all right, called Tiresias. Now, have any of you heard of Tiresias before? Do any of you know who Tiresias was?
Isn't that a character from the Odyssey?
He is a character in the Odyssey, yes.
He was.
Yeah, he's the seer that Odysseus has to consult in the underworld to figure out how to get back home, right? But this isn't referencing that part of the Tiresias myth.
Oh.
Tiresias is a character in Greek mythology who has been both a man and a woman. So, the way the story goes, Tiresias found two snakes coupling on the mountainside, and he hit them with a staff to knock them apart, naughty snakes, and was changed into a woman. Several years later, she is on the mountain, and she sees two snakes coupling again, hits him with a stick again, and is changed back into a man. And what makes this relevant to Eliot's poem is that this is a kind of background story for an argument between two of the gods who want to know whether men or women experience more pleasure in sex, right? And so they ask Tiresias because Tiresias has been both. So Tiresias is looking at this encounter, having been both man and woman and being able to understand both perspectives, right? So can I get somebody to start reading from At the Violet Hour, When the Eyes and Back?
The violet hour when the eyes and back turn upward from the dust, when the human engine waits like a taxi throbbing, waiting. I, Tiresias, both lying, robbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breast, and see at the violet hour the evening hour that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea. The typist home at tea time clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out her food and tins. Out of the window, carelessly spread her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled duds, perceive the scene and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. He, the young man, perpendicular, arrives. A small house agent's clerk, one bold stare. One of the low on whom assurance sits, of the silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now
Propitious.
propitious as he guesses the meal is ended. She is bored and tired. Endeavors to engage her in caresses, but still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Therese, who have foresuffered all and acted on this same divan or bed, I who have sat by Phoebe's below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead, bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit.
Okay, so what happens here between these two kids, the typist and the young man carbuncular? Which means pimply young man, right? What happens between these two characters?
Were they making love to each other?
Sort of, right? Making love might be a stretch here.
Oh, they were flirting with each other.
No, one of them attacks the other? No, okay.
Yeah, an attack might also be a little bit too strong a word, right? But yeah, I mean,
Passionately?
yeah, I mean, we can see what's going on here, right? That, you know, he starts fooling around with her. She doesn't stop him, right? But she doesn't encourage him either. And so what happens here is a kind of pointless, wasteful sexual encounter that no one enjoys, right?
So one night stand.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah, what we got is a kind of loveless, pointless sexual encounter. And then it follows on with, she turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over.
That poor woman. Oh.
But yeah, well, like, so this kind of fits into Eliot's idea of a kind of misuse of fertility, right? That, so like pointless sex, right, fits into his larger concept of like the larger malaise of European society. Which is why he puts it into this segment of the poem that is specifically concerned with purity, right? What is that horrible sound?
I don't
There's
know.
just something clacking in there.
I guess. Oh, sorry.
It sounds like a dryer.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's really
Yeah.
like a dryer in there.
Is it locked?
I don't really want to go in there.
It's locked.
Yep. So what we're getting here is a kind of sense of an enervated, decaying society, right? That only kind of is held together by fragments. We can continue like kind of like along this similar lines here, a similar theme. If we look on page 664, right? We've got the two women gossiping in the bar. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back, make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you've done with the money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did, I was there. You have more out, Lil, and get a nice set, he said. I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said, and think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years, he wants a good time. And if you don't give it him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something to that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique, and her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? So this conversation between these two like working class women in the bar, right? We've got this woman who has been too fertile, right? And she took some pills the chemist gave her to get rid of a pregnancy. And since then, her body isn't what it was, right? So she did something to kind of reduce her fertility, and it also caused her to lose all of her teeth and look older kind of before her time, right? So Eliot, I think we can put very much on the kind of, pro-fertility side of things, right? Pro people having babies and shit like that. Now, this isn't as disconnected from the idea of a fragmentary society. It's kind of like being put back together in bits, as it might initially seem. So, you may recall that this isn't the first time we've encountered Eliot. When we looked at, when we're looking at modernist aesthetics, right? We read an essay called Tradition of the Individual Talent. Now, do you remember anything that Eliot said in that essay about the literary tradition? What's the relationship between the tradition and the new work? How do they relate to each other?
The present is directed by the past.
Yeah.
Tradition is not is dead and not original. Living vital.
Yeah, not fixed.
Yeah. The tradition, the idea of tradition is never fixed, right?
Yeah.
Each new work that is added to the tradition doesn't just add a new thing on the end of it, but it also changes the way we look at everything else, the way we read everything that came before it, right? So each new work is in conversation with and kind of directs and changes the tradition. So what he's doing here is taking and adapting for his own purposes a bunch of materials from the tradition and kind of showing how you can use the tradition and combine it maybe with something else to create something wholly new, right? So this wasteland was an imaginative one as well that can be caused to grow again with an infusion from other sources. And those other sources for him are largely Asian sources. So if the European tradition looks like it's reaching its end point, Eliot and a lot of other artists at the time thought you could give it a shot in the arm by taking some energy from other traditions that they regarded wrongly as more primitive. So you may notice, for example, that a lot of Picasso's paintings, which date from around the same period, there are a lot of like faces that look like African masks and things like that, right? Now, Eliot's not looking towards Africa, he's looking mostly towards South Asia, towards India and Pakistan, right? But the principle is basically the same. Right, so the last portion of the poem, what the thunder saw, or what the thunder said, combines the Grail myth with the Fisher King and the Chapel Perilous with Hindu philosophy. So you have a specific instance here of taking something from the European tradition and combining it with something else to form a new synthesis, right? So if we look on page 672, Ganga, that is the river Ganges, was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered far distant over Himavan. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder, Datta, what have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this and this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent spider, or under seals broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Dayadavam, I have heard the key. Turn in the door once and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment a broken Coriolanus. Damyata, the boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm, your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore, fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? So, what this section here refers to is a story from the Hindu philosophical text called the Upanishads. And the thunder speaks a single syllable, da, that three different groups interpret in different ways, right? So, human beings, naturally selfish, hear datta, which means give. Demons, naturally cruel, hear dayadavam, which means love. And lesser gods, naturally chaotic, hear damyata, which means control. So what's happening here in this little parable? What is each group hearing this syllable of the thunder being told to do?
Be the opposite of your natural state.
Yeah, to go against their nature, right? Only by going against their nature does renewal happen.
What's that for lesser gods?
Chaotic.
Yeah.
And so human beings have to learn to give. Demons have to learn to love. and lesser gods have to learn self-control. And I think that these three things in particular, like these three commands in particular, speak to the heart of what Eliot sees as wrong in European society in the 1920s, right? The young man carbuncular, for example, approaches the typist selfishly without love and fails to control himself, right? Resulting in what by 1921 standards wouldn't have been a sexual assault, but by our standards certainly looks like one, right? So I would argue that this is the path forward from here that Eliot gives us, right? And that the way that we get to it is by putting these fragments together, right? By holding ourselves together with fragments of what's still good, right? Of what's left to us. So, does this make any more sense to you now than it did when you first tried to read it? Okay, so we're going to stop there. I think we're about at a time anyway. And we will reconvene on Wednesday to talk about romantic poetry and work.